I don't think I'll ever forget the way the air in my chest froze solid when I twisted my key in the front door, expecting nothing more than the comfort of silence after a long, dragging drive home, only to be hit with a roar of voices, clinking glasses, and the unmistakable swell of music that sounded far too celebratory to belong to any ordinary Tuesday evening. I had been on the road for hours, my mind wandering between exhaustion and the simple, predictable relief of stepping into my own quiet space, collapsing onto the couch, and maybe ordering takeout because I hadn't eaten since that grim rest stop sandwich. The only thing that had kept me going was the picture I painted in my head of a peaceful night. My bag dropped at the door, shoes kicked off, and me sinking into the kind of solitude that comes when you live alone and no one is waiting for you. So when the door creaked open and the smell of too many different foods clashed in the air, when the lights from my kitchen spilled like a beacon down the hallway, and laughter rang out like it had been living in the walls for hours, my brain simply refused to process it. I froze there, the door halfway open, my suitcase tilting dangerously behind me, while my house, throbbed with life. And then I saw the banner, stretched from one side of my living room wall to the other, drooping a little in the middle, but proudly declaring in bold, glittering red letters, "Family means forever." At first I thought maybe I'd walked into the wrong house, though the sight of my scratched coffee table piled with paper plates and soda cans quickly tore that illusion away. No, this was my house. My lamp in the corner, tilted slightly from when I bumped into it last week. My shoes by the mat. My couch cushions, the ones I'd picked out because they didn't stain easily, now buried under a couple of children I didn't recognize who were watching cartoons at a volume so loud the windows practically shook. And yet, 92 people. I know that sounds like an exaggeration, like I'm inflating the number the way people do when they claim there were hundreds of folks at a party, but I counted later, 92. Some relatives I vaguely recognized from childhood weddings or funerals, some I'd never seen before in my life. Cousins, aunts, in-laws, people clutching casserole dishes and toddlers, uncles balancing paper plates, stacked with barbecue, teenagers leaning against my kitchen counters like they owned the place. And in that first suspended second, it felt less like a reunion and more like an invasion, a hostile takeover disguised with balloons and potato salad. My voice caught somewhere between a shout and a whisper, but the sound was lost under the wave of commotion, and it wasn't until one of them, a woman in her 50s, floral blouse, earrings that dangled like wind chimes, noticed me standing there with wide eyes and road dust still on my clothes, that the collective noise dipped just enough for her to gasp, "You're early!" As if I was the one intruding. As if my mistake wasn't walking into a crowd that had somehow decided my absence meant my house was fair game. And in that instant, with 92 pairs of eyes swiveling toward me, I realized the night was not going to be anything like the peaceful evening I had promised myself during the drive home. It was going to be chaos, the kind that only family, distant, overbearing, uninvited family, can conjure, wrapped in the excuse of tradition, armed with the banner that told me resistance was futile. Family means forever. The part of it all wasn't even the sheer number of bodies crammed into every corner of my living room and kitchen, but how quickly the narrative shifted from me discovering them to them reacting, as though I was late to my own event. It was dizzying. I had been bracing myself for apologies, for stammering explanations, maybe even for a guilty face or two trying to justify why nearly 100 relatives had turned my house into a banquet hall without asking. Instead, I was greeted by cheers, actual cheers, like some celebrity making a surprise entrance at their own birthday. A cousin I hadn't seen in 15 years slapped me on the back so hard, I almost dropped my keys, shouting over the din, "You made it just in time!" Another relative shoved a plate into my hands before I'd even set my suitcase down, piled high with macaroni, ribs, and something that looked suspiciously like the green bean casserole my mother used to make. I blinked down at it, the heat from the food steaming up into my face, while my brain scrambled to catch up to the logic, or lack thereof. I hadn't invited them. I hadn't known about any of this. And yet they welcomed me with the warmth of people who had been planning around me the entire time, as though I was the guest of honor rather than the blindsided homeowner. Every inch of my house told a different story than the one I left behind. The dining table I had left spotless was now a chaotic spread of aluminum trays and Tupperware lids, covered in spills and sticky fingerprints. The couch that was supposed to be waiting for me was occupied by 3 separate conversations, a pair of elderly uncles arguing about politics, a teenager scrolling on his phone, and 2 toddlers smearing chocolate on the cushions like they were finger painting. Even my bedroom door at the end of the hall was cracked open, and I swear I caught sight of coats piled high on my bed like it was a coat check station. I tried to open my mouth, to assert myself, to at least reclaim a sliver of authority in my own house. But the noise and momentum of it all swallowed me whole. Someone tugged me toward the kitchen where the banner hung like a declaration of war, and as I stumbled through the sea of bodies, I couldn't help but feel like a stranger in my own home. The walls were the same, the floors the same, but the atmosphere had been rewritten entirely in my absence. That was the first moment I realized this wasn't just a gathering. It was something planned, something orchestrated. A family reunion staged without my consent, hosted in my house, built on the assumption that because my last name matched theirs, I would have no choice but to surrender. And the most unnerving part was how quickly the crowd adapted to my arrival, folding me into the current of activity, like I'd been expected to step through the door right then. Right there? As if fate had scheduled it. Nobody blinked at the shock on my face. Nobody offered a real explanation. Instead, they wrapped their arms around me, stuffed food into my hands, and threw the phrase, "Family means forever?" into conversation like it was a mantra meant to dissolve any resistance. I wanted to scream that forever didn't mean in my house. That forever didn't mean without warning or permission, but every time I opened my mouth, another relative cut in with a story, a laugh, or a plate of food. What unsettled me most in those first moments wasn't even the noise, or the fact that strangers were spilling red punch across my countertops, or the way toddlers I didn't recognize were darting in and out of my hallway like it was a playground. It was how natural all of it looked, like the house itself had accepted this new reality and was betraying me by going along with it. Every picture frame I'd hung with my own hands, every shelf I had carefully dusted before leaving, every corner I thought I had memorized, now belonged to someone else's narrative. It was surreal. My framed photo of the beach trip with college friends now had greasy fingerprints smudged across the glass because some teenager had leaned against it mid-conversation. The rug I had bought last year after saving for months was buried under folding chairs that had clearly been dragged in without care. My kitchen counter, the one I had painstakingly organized, was drowning under Tupperware lids, mismatched utensils, and condensation puddles from sweating soda bottles. It felt less like a family reunion and more like my identity as a homeowner had been overwritten by an invading culture, one where the rules were written by whoever showed up first with a casserole dish. And the strangest part was the way no one questioned it, as if the sight of me standing there, mouth open in shock, was just a formality before I blended into their rhythm. People clapped me on the back, tugged me into conversations, laughed as though my bewilderment was part of the entertainment. At some point, someone shoved a paper crown on my head, one of those flimsy things from a party supply store, and declared me the returning king, as if I had just come back to preside over a festival in my honor. I wanted to rip it off, to shout that none of this was mine, but the wave of voices drowned out every attempt. I felt like a swimmer caught in a riptide, dragged farther from shore with every second. And then I started to notice something even more disturbing: the level of organization. The tables weren't thrown together haphazardly. They had been arranged with purpose, lining my walls in neat rows, forming aisles like a makeshift dining hall. The banner wasn't cheap or rushed, it was carefully printed, the kind of thing you had to order weeks in advance. There were name tags, actual name tags, sitting on my side table, as though someone had prepared for introductions between relatives who didn't know each other. It wasn't chaos born of spontaneity. It was structure disguised as chaos, which meant planning. Which meant that, at some point, a decision had been made that my house was the location, and that I was either irrelevant or simply assumed to be compliant. That thought sent a chill down my spine that even the warmth of 90, two bodies couldn't erase. If they had planned it, who had given them permission? Who had held the keys to my life without me knowing? And if they hadn't needed my permission at all, then what did that say about the thin line between family and trespasser? The longer I stood there, trying to make sense of the impossible, the more I realized that resistance was not going to be as simple as raising my voice or reclaiming a corner of my house. The sheer density of bodies, the casual authority with which they occupied each room, the momentum of conversations layered on top of music and clattering dishes, it was like trying to halt a river with my bare hands. Every time I moved, someone intercepted me, pulling me into their orbit with the ease of people who assumed I belonged to them. An older man with a beard down to his chest gripped my shoulder and started telling me a long story about how he once drove across 3 states to surprise his sister, speaking as though I had been waiting all year to hear the anecdote. A little girl clutched my arm and insisted I help her fix the strap on her doll's dress, tugging me toward the hallway where I could see my bedroom door now wide open, piles of coats and bags burying my bed. I wanted to scream, to demand why my sanctuary had been turned into a storage closet, but her small hands were insistent and my words dissolved before I could even try. Then came the food. Endless food, shoved into my hands, onto my plate, toward my mouth. A woman I couldn't place spooned macaroni onto my plate, even as I tried to set it down, while another insisted I taste her special stew. And before I knew it, I was holding 3 different plates at once, none of which I wanted. My house was a carnival I had never bought a ticket for, and the banner overhead, "Family means forever," hung like a threat, reminding me that any protest would be drowned in the tide of tradition and obligation. My frustration simmered in my chest, growing hotter with each passing second, but then I began to notice something else beneath the surface of the chaos of glances. Not just random glances of family members catching sight of me, but deliberate ones exchanged between certain relatives like coded signals. A pair of cousins whispering near the kitchen doorway, pausing when I drew too close. An aunt adjusting her glasses and flicking her eyes toward me, then toward the banner, then away. A teenager pulling out his phone, typing furiously, and slipping it back into his pocket with the secrecy of someone smuggling information. It wasn't paranoia. I know what a secret looks like when it's being kept in plain sight. And it hit me, with a sick weight in my stomach, that this wasn't just a reunion designed to celebrate family. This was something orchestrated, something that had roles and expectations, and I was walking into it blind. The banner wasn't decoration, it was doctrine, a reminder that whatever was happening here wasn't going to end with me shutting the door and asking everyone to leave. They had chosen my house for a reason, and that reason had teeth. I tried to tell myself that maybe I was overthinking, that maybe the glances I caught and the silences that fell when I stepped too close were nothing more than coincidences born of a crowded room and too many overlapping conversations. But the longer I lingered, the less convincing that explanation became, because the patterns were too deliberate, too carefully timed to brush aside. It was as if a second conversation hummed beneath the noise of the party, one I wasn't invited to hear, yet one that revolved entirely around me. I would catch it in the smiles exchanged between relatives I didn't recognize, in the way they would lean close and mutter just as I passed, their eyes darting my way before they quickly looked down at their drinks. I saw it in the nervous fidgeting of an older aunt, who kept wringing her hands whenever I entered the kitchen, in the way a young man with a crew cut stood near the hallway as if guarding it, shifting just enough to block me each time I tried to head toward my own bedroom. And the strangest part was how smoothly all of it was wrapped in hospitality, as though the conspiracy, if that's what it was, wore a mask of casseroles and small talk. I had never felt so surrounded yet, so excluded at the same time. My name echoed in the air, spoken in snippets I couldn't follow, but always just out of reach, cut off when I got too close. I tried to corner one of them, my cousin I think, though I couldn't even remember his name, and asked, point blank, who had organized this gathering, but he laughed, loud and fake, slapping me on the back with such force that the question dissolved into the air before I could push it again. "We're just happy you're here," he said, but his eyes slid away too fast, as if he'd rehearsed the line and wanted to escape before I asked again. I told myself I should assert control, demand answers, maybe even call the police if it came to that, but the thought of standing against 2 people, all bound by the same surname and the same banner, made my throat tighten. It wasn't just about noise and trespass anymore. It was about intent, and I had the sickening feeling that intent ran deeper than any of them wanted me to know. By the time the clock in my kitchen ticked past 9, though I couldn't be sure, because half the guests had draped jackets and scarves over it as though time itself no longer mattered. The weight of the night pressed down on me so heavily that I felt like a guest inside the very walls I paid for. The laughter, the chatter, the clinking of glasses. It all blurred into a low, constant hum that sank beneath my skin until it was impossible to tell if the vibrations came from the voices or from my own nerves rattling. I tried 3 separate times to slip away, once toward the back door, once toward the garage, and once, foolishly, toward the front hallway, suitcase still waiting where I had dropped it, but each time I was intercepted. Someone's hand on my shoulder, someone's voice booming in my ear, someone tugging me toward another circle of relatives who insisted I hear about the summer vacation they took 10 years ago, or how their youngest had just started piano lessons. The entire house had become a maze with moving walls, Corridors blocked not by doors, but by bodies that rearranged themselves whenever I tried to push through. And all the while, that banner loomed overhead, sagging slightly at the corners, glowing under the yellow light of my ceiling lamp, like some sacred scripture, family means forever. I wanted to tear it down, to rip it to shreds and shout that forever wasn't supposed to feel like a trap, but the words died in my throat because every face turned toward me carried that same unwavering certainty that what they were doing was right. That certainty terrified me more than the chaos itself. If this had been a mistake, a party gone wrong, I could have shouted, demanded, fought back. But this wasn't a mistake. It was a conviction, one shared by nearly 100 people who believed that my home was theirs to claim, that my protest meant nothing against the tide of bloodlines and last names. I kept glancing toward the hallway where my bedroom door remained half open, as if mocking me with the promise of solitude just out of reach, but the man stationed there, tall, silent, arms crossed, never moved. His presence wasn't casual, it was deliberate, a guard posted in plain sight. And I began to wonder, for the first time that night, if leaving was even possible anymore, or if the door that had opened so easily for me hours earlier had quietly locked itself behind me. I don't know exactly when the night stopped feeling like a family gathering and started feeling like a ritual, but at some point, somewhere between the third time someone tried to crown me with a flimsy paper hat and the moment an uncle I barely remembered raised a toast in my direction, I realized the entire evening had been steering toward something, like every word, every laugh, every shared plate of food had been rehearsed to lead me to a single conclusion. The atmosphere shifted almost imperceptibly, laughter quieting into murmurs, movements slowing, people subtly turning so that their bodies created a wide circle in the middle of my living room. And there I was, standing at the center of it all, my heart pounding, the banner sagging overhead as though it were the final act in some play I hadn't agreed to star in. Nenity, two faces, some vaguely familiar and some utterly foreign, watched me with an intensity that burned hotter than the lights above. I tried to speak, to ask what was happening, but the words tangled on my tongue, caught between fear and disbelief. Then one of them, a woman with sharp eyes and a voice that carried like a judge's gavel, stepped forward. She didn't introduce herself, didn't explain, didn't soften her tone. She simply declared, as if reading a sentence handed down from something older than any of us, that I had returned a day early because it was meant to be, that the house was not just a house but a gathering place, that the blood running through my veins bound me to something larger than myself. The crowd murmured in agreement, nodding, smiling, reaching out their hands as though to weave me into their tapestry. My chest tightened, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my feet refused to move, pinned down by the weight of so many gazes. And then she said it, the words that froze the air in my lungs and sent a chill crawling down my spine. Family means forever, and forever begins with you. The circle closed and then, gently but firmly, hands brushing my arms, shoulders pressing against mine, bodies tightening around me until I could feel the collective heat of Nenti, two people merging into one presence. My house no longer belonged to me, my walls no longer answered to my name, and in that suffocating moment I understood that forever was not a promise, but a sentence.